moment a dog exposed the truth in court. Little girl's secret signal shocks the judge. What if the only one capable of revealing the truth wasn't a person at all? What if, in a courtroom filled with arguments, evidence, and deception, the most important witness couldn't speak, but still saw everything? In this world, truth isn't always what it seems. People lie. They twist words, hide secrets, and deceive even the sharpest minds. But there is one kind of loyalty that never wavers. One witness who cannot be fooled. A dog. Because a dog sees what others miss. A dog knows fear, love, and deception, not through words, but through instinct. And sometimes, when the truth is buried beneath fear and silence, it takes the purest heart to bring it to light. The courtroom was still. The judge, the lawyers, the spectators, all watching, all waiting. A little girl sat on the witness stand, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her voice barely above a whisper. Next to her, a dog lay at her feet, unmoving. At first, it seemed like any other case. Just another trial, just another testimony. But then, something changed. A single moment, a flicker of movement, a quiet sound, sent a wave of tension through the room. The dog reacted first. And what happened next left everyone in shock. Because in a place where words could be twisted, where the truth could be buried beneath fear and manipulation, the last witness anyone expected was about to expose everything. Sophie Reynolds had never been the loudest child in the room. She was quiet, observant, the kind of girl who clung to the corners of a conversation rather than the center. But she wasn't shy, just careful. She had learned far too young that words had power, that speaking the wrong ones could bring trouble, that silence was often safer. And so she rarely spoke more than necessary. But there was one soul in the world who never needed her words to understand her. Mac, the golden retriever, had been in Sophie's life since she was 4 years old, a gift from her mother after long nights of crying and restless sleep. He wasn't just a pet. He was her shadow, her protector, her one true source of comfort. From the moment he padded into their home, his golden fur warm and soft under her small hands, Sophie had clung to him like a lifeline. Max had been there through everything. Through the nights when Sophie lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as muffled voices rose from downstairs. At first, it had just been sharp whispers, words clipped with frustration but still controlled. Her mother's voice, tight with exhaustion, pleading for Richard to just listen. Her father's tone, cool and dismissive, shutting her down before she could even finish. But the whispers never stayed whispers for long. One night, Sophie had been coloring in the living room when it started again. "I told you, Ruth, I don't have time for this right now." Richard's voice was sharp, cutting through the air like a whip. Ruth stood in the kitchen, her hands braced against the counter, trying to stay calm. "You never have time, Richard. It's always another business trip, another late night at the office. Sophie needs you." "Sophie has everything she needs," he snapped, running a frustrated hand through his hair. "A big house, the best school, whatever she wants. Except for a father who actually acts like he cares," Ruth shot back, her voice cracking. Silence. For a moment, Sophie thought maybe, just maybe, her father would soften, that he would say something to make it better. Instead, Richard let out a cold laugh. "You're unbelievable." The tension in the air was unbearable. Max, sensing Sophie's unease, nudged his head under her hand, his warm fur grounding her in the moment. She clung to him, gripping his soft ears as her parents' voices clashed again. And that was just the beginning. The fights became more frequent, more vicious. The arguments shifted from frustration to blame. Richard accused Ruth of holding him back, of not understanding the pressures he faced. Ruth accused Richard of neglecting their daughter, of caring more about his image than his own family. And then one night, it got worse. A loud crash rang through the house, followed by Ruth's sharp gasp. Sophie shot up in bed, heart hammering. She raced to the top of the stairs just in time to see a broken glass shatter across the floor. Max was already at her side, ears pricked, his body tense. "Ruth, stop being so dramatic," Richard scoffed, his arms crossed. I didn't throw it at you. It slipped. Ruth's face was pale, her hands trembling at her sides. You don't even realize how cruel you've become, she whispered. Richard exhaled sharply, shaking his head. You're impossible. Sophie felt Max press against her legs, his warm presence the only thing keeping her from crying. That was the night Ruth made her decision. The night she realized staying wasn't an option anymore. And from that moment on, everything changed. Max had been there. At first, Sophie had been spared from the worst of it. When the arguments were just between her parents, she could pretend not to hear. She could press her face into Max's fur and let his steady breathing drown out the noise. She could believe that in the morning, everything would go back to normal. But it didn't. The first time her father snapped at her, she barely recognized his voice. She had been playing with Max in the living room when Richard came home, slamming the front door so hard that the walls shook. Sophie jumped, startled, as Max immediately stood between her and the sound. Richard was on the phone, his face tight with frustration. No, I don't care what they said, he barked. Fix it. I don't pay you to come to me with problems. Sophie peeked up at him, wide-eyed. Dad? Richard's head whipped toward her so fast that she shrank back. For a moment his face was unreadable. Then, just as quickly as the anger had come, it was gone. He forced a smile, ruffling her hair a little too roughly. Not now, sweetheart, he said, his voice still clipped. That was the first time. The next time it was worse. It had started small. Richard had never been a patient man, but now his fuse was shorter than ever. If Sophie spoke too softly, he'd sigh in frustration. If she hesitated to answer his questions, his eyes would darken. If she clung to her mother too tightly, his jaw would clench. Then, one day, it changed. Sophie had just finished her homework when Richard arrived to pick her up for his weekend visit. She had always felt nervous about going to his house, but today, there was something heavier in the air. Ruth knelt beside her, smoothing her hair. You can call me anytime, okay? She whispered, pressing a kiss to Sophie's forehead. Richard's voice cut through the moment like a blade. Let's go, Sophie. She nodded quickly, not wanting to upset him. But as she reached for her overnight bag, Max suddenly let out a quiet whine, nudging his nose against her hand. It was almost as if he knew. At Richard's house, things were different. His apartment was big, cold, and eerily spotless. Nothing like the warm, cluttered home she shared with her mother. There were rules. Sit up straight. Don't slouch. Speak clearly. Sophie tried her best, but no matter what she did, it was never quite right. One evening, she accidentally knocked over a glass of water. It wasn't much, just a few drops on the polished wooden table. But the second it happened, Richard's face twisted in frustration. Seriously, Sophie? His voice was sharp, impatient. You need to pay attention. She froze, eyes wide. I'm sorry. Richard exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. Forget it, he muttered, pushing away from the table. Sophie bit her lip, swallowing the lump in her throat. Max wasn't here. Her protector wasn't here. And without him, she felt so small. Then came the worst part, the way Richard talked about her mother. Your mom is too soft on you, he would say, shaking his head. She doesn't know how to prepare you for the real world. Or worse. You know she's wrong about me, right? She's always making me the bad guy. Sophie never knew how to respond. If she stayed quiet, his gaze would harden. If she nodded, he would smile, but it wasn't the kind of smile that made her feel safe. Then, one night he asked a question that made her stomach twist. You like it here better, don't you? Sophie hesitated. Richard's expression darkened. Sophie. She flinched. I like both. His fingers tapped against the table. That's not what I asked. Her hands clenched in her lap. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I don't know. Richard's eyes narrowed. The next time she saw her mother, she clung to her so tightly that Ruth had to gently pry her fingers away just to look at her face. Sweetheart, she murmured, cupping Sophie's cheek. Did something happen? Sophie shook her head quickly. I'm okay. Because Richard had told her not to talk about what happened at his house. That it was their special time. That her mother wouldn't understand. And for the first time, Sophie understood something too. She wasn't just caught between two parents. She was caught in a battle she didn't know how to fight. But Max had seen it all. And when the time came, he would make sure she wasn't fighting alone. And now, as they sat in the middle of the courtroom, he was here for her again. The custody battle had been dragging on for months, the tension growing heavier with every hearing. Sophie's mother, Ruth, had fought tooth and nail to keep her daughter safe. But Richard Reynolds was a man with power, influence, and an uncanny ability to twist the truth in his favor. He was charming, persuasive, a businessman who knew exactly how to present himself. He had convinced the court that Ruth was unfit, that she was manipulating Sophie, that she was incapable of raising her alone. But Ruth knew the truth. She had known it for a long time. She had known it in the way Sophie's posture changed whenever she had to leave with Richard, how her shoulders tensed, how her grip tightened around Max's fur, how her eyes darted to her mother, like she wanted to say something but never did. She had known it in the way Sophie came back from those visits quieter than before, as if she were carrying something too heavy for an 8-year-old to bear. How she flinched at sharp tones, how she hesitated before answering simple questions, how she seemed to measure every word before speaking, like she was afraid of saying the wrong thing. And then there were the things Sophie wouldn't say. Whenever Ruth asked, "Did you have fun with your dad?" the response was always the same, short, rehearsed, lifeless. Yeah, it was fine. Never more, never less. At first, Ruth had tried to convince herself that maybe Sophie was just adjusting, that maybe it was the tension between her and Richard that made their daughter uncomfortable. But then there were the nights Sophie woke up crying. The nights she came running into Ruth's room, burying herself under the covers without saying a word, clinging to Max like he was the only thing keeping her safe. The times she whispered things in her sleep. "I'm sorry, I'll do better. Please don't be mad." Ruth's heart had shattered 100 times over, because she knew exactly what was happening. Richard had always been a man who thrived on control. He didn't tolerate mistakes, didn't accept failure. In the early years of their marriage, Ruth had tried to keep up, to meet his impossible expectations, to soften his sharp words with patience and understanding. But it had never been enough. And now Sophie was the one trapped under that same weight. Richard wasn't the kind of father who shouted in public or left bruises where people could see. No, he was much more careful than that. His control was quieter, more calculated. It was in the way he made Sophie second-guess herself. The way he turned small accidents into lessons, not to teach, but to instill fear. The way he made her believe that love was something she had to earn. He didn't have to yell to make Sophie feel small. A sharp look, a disappointed sigh, a single, measured word, those were enough to make her shrink. And Ruth hated him for it. She hated how he had taken their bright, carefree little girl and made her afraid of making a mistake. But what terrified her the most was that no one else could see it. To the outside world, Richard Reynolds was charming, successful, a doting father who wanted what was best for his child. He spoke well, dressed well, carried himself with the confidence of a man who never lost. He knew how to perform, and people believed him. The court believed him. They looked at him, his wealth, his stability, and saw a man who could provide Sophie with opportunities Ruth never could. And Richard knew that. He used it against her every chance he got. She needs structure, Ruth, not coddling. She's too soft, just like you. You don't prepare her for the real world. You're setting her up to fail. And worst of all, she belongs with me. Ruth had fought. She had screamed at the injustice of it all. She had told the courts that money wasn't the same as love, that Sophie needed safety, not just stability. But Richard knew how to twist the narrative. She's emotional, he had told them with that infuriating, practiced calm. She's upset about the divorce, and she's turning that into paranoia. I don't blame her. It's been hard on all of us. They nodded, agreed. given him the benefit of the doubt, and Ruth had watched, helpless, as the truth was buried beneath Richard's carefully constructed lies. But Sophie knew, and Max knew, and Ruth swore to herself, no matter what it took, no matter how many people she had to fight, the world would know too. And Sophie did too. Yet, in a case like this, the truth wasn't always easy to prove. Words could be twisted, facts could be manipulated, and for a little girl caught in the middle, standing against someone far more powerful, the odds were stacked against her. So today, Sophie sat on the witness stand, small and quiet with Max at her side. The courtroom was tense. Eyes were on her. The weight of the moment pressed down like a heavy storm cloud. Would she be able to speak the truth? Would anyone believe her? Or would the lies win? But Sophie wasn't alone, because Max was there, watching, listening, ready. And soon the entire courtroom would realize some truths don't need words to be heard. What do you think will happen next? Will Sophie find the courage to reveal the truth? And will the one who stands by her side, her most loyal protector, be the key to everything? Hit like if you believe in the power of loyalty. Subscribe now so you don't miss this incredible story. Because sometimes, the ones who see the truth aren't the ones you expect. The entire courtroom was waiting, the judge watching her closely, the attorneys poised with their questions. Ruth sat on one side, hopeful but nervous. Richard on the other, his smirk confident, his eyes daring Sophie to say the wrong thing. Sophie wasn't alone. Max lay at her feet, his presence steady, unwavering. And soon he would do something that no one expected. Because sometimes, the truth didn't need words. Sometimes it just needed a dog who refused to ignore it. Richard Reynolds was not just any businessman. He was a man who knew how to command a room with nothing more than a smile. With his tailored suits, polished words, and the confidence of someone who had never been denied anything in his life, he had built an empire on charm and manipulation. He was powerful, wealthy, and, at least on paper, everything a responsible father should be. And he made sure the court saw him that way. He spoke of the lavish life he could give Sophie, the best schools, the finest clothes, opportunities her mother could never dream of affording. He painted Ruth as struggling, barely making ends meet, too emotionally fragile to care for a child on her own. The argument seemed straightforward. Wealth versus struggle, comfort versus uncertainty. To most people in the courtroom, it looked like a simple choice. But something was wrong. Because when Sophie was asked about her father, she hesitated. Her fingers curled in her lap, her shoulders stiff. Her answers were short, carefully measured. She never said anything bad about him, but she never said anything good either. It wasn't the hesitation of a child caught between two loving parents. It wasn't the confusion of someone unsure of what to say. It was something else. To the attorneys, the judge, and the spectators in the courtroom, it looked like Sophie was just a shy little girl, overwhelmed by the weight of the moment. But Max knew better. The golden retriever sat at her feet, still and quiet, but his body was tense. His ears twitched at every sound, his intelligent eyes locked onto Sophie with an intensity that no one noticed. Because Max had been there. He had seen the moments no one else had. He had felt Sophie flinch when voices rose too loud, and had curled against her when silent tears soaked into his fur. He had heard the way her breathing changed when the front door slammed, how she would grip his collar tightly when footsteps approached. Max didn't need words to understand what Sophie couldn't say. And today, in this courtroom, he would make sure the truth was heard. The morning air was heavy with anticipation as Sophie stepped into the courthouse, her small hand clutching her mother's. The grand building loomed above them, its towering pillars and cold marble floors making everything feel bigger, heavier. To an outsider, it was just another day of legal proceedings. But to Sophie, it was the most important day of her life. Ruth walked beside her, her grip firm yet gentle, a silent promise that she would never let go. But even as she tried to stay strong, the weight of the case pressed down on her shoulders. This wasn't just about custody. It wasn't just about which home Sophie would live in. It was about safety, about justice, about revealing the truth hidden beneath layers of charm and deception. Richard Reynolds, a man of status and wealth, had made it seem like a simple battle, one where he was the obvious winner. He had the resources, the influence, the perfect image of a doting father who only wanted what was best for his daughter. But Ruth knew better, and so did Sophie. The courtroom was packed, reporters whispering among themselves, lawyers flipping through files, judges and clerks moved with practiced precision. But beneath it all, there was an undercurrent of tension. Richard arrived with his expensive suit and practiced smirk, shaking hands with his attorney as if he had already won, as if today was just a formality. His confidence was unwavering. He had crafted his argument well. He had painted himself as the father Sophie needed, a man of means, stability, and discipline. But no amount of wealth could change the truth. Sophie sat beside her mother, her feet barely reaching the floor, her fingers gripping Max's soft fur. She knew what was expected of her today, knew that the words she spoke would determine everything. She also knew the fear that held her back, because telling the truth wasn't always as simple as saying it out loud. But that was why Max was here. Because when Sophie's voice failed her, he would be the one to make sure the world finally saw what had been hidden for too long. The judge sighed, adjusting his glasses as he looked down at Sophie, his expression gentle but firm. The weight of the decision rested on her small shoulders, and though he had seen many custody battles in his years on the bench, something about this one unsettled him. There was a stiffness in the air, a quiet tension that hadn't eased since the hearing began. He leaned forward slightly. "Sweetheart, we need to know where you would feel happiest. Do you like spending time with your daddy?" Across the courtroom, Richard Reynolds sat up straighter, smoothing a hand over his pristine suit as he flashed a warm, practiced smile. "Go ahead, Sophie," he encouraged smoothly, his voice coated in the perfect balance of reassurance and expectation. "Tell them how much fun we have." Every eye in the courtroom turned to Sophie. Her small fingers clenched into the fabric of her dress, her knuckles paling. The air felt too heavy, the walls felt too close. She could feel Richard's gaze on her, feel the way his confidence pressed down like an invisible force, telling her what answer she was supposed to give. She swallowed hard, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Yes." A satisfied smirk flickered across Richard's lips. On the other side of the courtroom, Ruth's breath caught in her throat. She tried to hide the way her hands clenched, but the slight tremble in her shoulders gave her away. Ruth, her attorney, let out a quiet sigh, her expression carefully neutral. It was exactly what they had feared. Sophie was too scared to speak against her father. Richard knew it too. He relaxed back into his chair, his victory all but certain. He had played his cards perfectly. Sophie wouldn't dare say anything against him, not here, not in front of all these people, not when she knew what would happen when the doors closed and the crowd disappeared. For a moment, it seemed like the case had been decided. But then, beneath the table, unnoticed by most, a small movement. Sophie's fingers curled into a pattern. A simple, deliberate motion. A signal. Max's ears twitched. His sharp, intelligent eyes flickered toward her. And he understood. The golden retriever moved in an instant, his body tensing as he sprang to his feet. His usual gentle, friendly demeanor vanished, replaced with something protective, something warning. He stepped in front of Sophie, blocking her from view, his body firm, unmoving. Then, a low growl, not a snarl, not a threat, a warning. The room fell into stunned silence. Ruth's breath hitched. Ruth straightened in her seat, her eyes widening. The judge's brow furrowed as he looked down at the dog, his hands pausing mid-adjustment of his glasses. Sophie's heart pounded, her tiny fingers twisting into Max's thick fur. Across the courtroom, Richard's expression stiffened. His smile wavered, then disappeared altogether as his jaw clenched. He forced out a chuckle, though it came out too sharp, too forced. "Control that dog," he snapped, masking the irritation in his voice with mock amusement. "Looks like he's just a little restless, huh, sweetheart?" Sophie didn't move. Neither did Max. Because this wasn't restlessness. It wasn't defiance. It was a message. One that only Sophie and Max understood. One that meant danger. The judge frowned, his sharp eyes narrowing as he studied the golden retriever standing so rigidly in front of the little girl. Max wasn't barking. He wasn't lunging or baring his teeth. But his stance, protective, unyielding, sent a chill through the room. "That's unusual," the judge murmured, his grip tightening on the wooden gavel in his hand. He had presided over countless custody cases, had seen nervous children, bitter ex-spouses, and legal teams arguing over every last detail, but never before had he seen a dog react like this. On the opposite side of the courtroom, Ruth sat up straighter, her breath catching, her hands pressed into the table as her pulse quickened. She had seen Max do this before, more than once. She had seen him place himself between Sophie and others, had witnessed the way his body language changed whenever Richard entered the room. She had noticed how the dog's posture mirrored Sophie's fear, how his instincts seemed to sharpen whenever her father spoke. And suddenly the pattern became painfully clear. The hesitations, the careful, measured words, the fear in Sophie's wide blue eyes. She wasn't choosing her father. She was too afraid to say otherwise. Ruth wasn't the only one who noticed. Her co-counsel's jaw tightened as realization dawned, and he leaned forward urgently. "Your Honor, I request a brief recess to investigate something crucial to this case." His voice was calm, steady, but beneath the professionalism there was something urgent, something unshakable. Across the room, Richard let out a sharp, incredulous scoff, his lips curling into a mocking smirk. "This is ridiculous," he said, gesturing toward Max, as though the entire situation was laughable. "It's a dog. What could he possibly tell you?" But the judge was no fool. He had spent decades in this courtroom, watching as people lied, manipulated, and twisted the truth for their own gain. He had seen money buy silence, power tip the scales of justice, and children pulled between parents who claimed to love them. But in all his years he had learned one thing: children often hid the truth. Dogs did not. His gaze shifted from Sophie's small, trembling hands to Max's unwavering stance. Something wasn't right. He adjusted his glasses, nodding once. "Granted." And that was the moment everything changed. The break was brief, but to Sophie it felt like an eternity. She was led to a quiet, softly lit room away from the cold formality of the courtroom. The walls were painted in calming pastel tones. A few stuffed animals sat on a nearby shelf, and a small couch rested in the corner. But none of it eased the weight in her chest. She sat stiffly in the chair, her small fingers gripping the hem of her dress. The child psychologist, a kind-looking woman with warm eyes, knelt beside her, speaking in a voice so gentle it felt like a lullaby. "Sophie, sweetheart, you're safe here. You can talk to me about anything. No one is going to hurt you." But Sophie didn't look at her. She looked at Max. The golden retriever sat right beside her, his body pressed close, his warmth steady and familiar. He wasn't just a pet, he was her shield, her protector, the only one who had ever truly understood. His deep brown eyes locked onto hers as if silently reminding her, "You're not alone." Slowly, her tiny fingers reached out, curling into the soft fur of his neck. She took a shaky breath, and then she spoke. It started as a whisper, halting, fragile. The long nights of fear, the rules that had to be followed, the punishments when she didn't act the way her father wanted, when she didn't smile enough, when she didn't speak the way he liked, when she wasn't the perfect little girl he had crafted in his mind. How she had learned to tiptoe around him, to keep quiet, to never ever disobey. The way her mother had tried to protect her but never fully knew. How Ruth had been led to believe that Richard's strictness was just him being a concerned father. And through it all, every cold stare, every harsh word, every time her small body tensed in fear, Max had known. He had always known. He had placed himself between her and Richard whenever he sensed the shift in the air, had leaned against her to keep her grounded, had growled when the tension grew too thick. He had understood before she even had the words to explain it. Now, the words were spilling out, tumbling from her lips in a voice that trembled with months, years of fear she had bottled up. The psychologist listened, her face unreadable, but her eyes filled with understanding. She nodded, never interrupting, never rushing, just letting Sophie release everything she had been too scared to say. By the time she was done, Sophie's cheeks were damp. Her tiny hands clutched Max's fur like he was the only thing keeping her steady. And maybe he was. The psychologist exhaled slowly, then rose to her feet with a new determination in her eyes. Because now, the truth was out. And the court was about to hear it all. When they stepped back into the courtroom, the air felt different, charged, heavy with the weight of unspoken truths that were finally ready to be heard. Ruth sat taller now, no longer burdened by the hopeless exhaustion that had worn her down for months. She held her breath, her hands clasped together, waiting. The judge's face remained unreadable, his fingers steepled as he carefully examined the papers in front of him. But Richard? The arrogance that once clung to him like a second skin had vanished. His smirk was gone, replaced by a rigid jaw and darting eyes. He shifted in his seat, trying to compose himself, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed him. He knew. The truth was out. The judge cleared his throat, his gaze settling on Sophie. His voice, though firm, was softer this time. "Sweetheart, do you feel safe with your father?" Silence. A moment stretched longer than any before. But this time, Sophie didn't hesitate. She shook her head. The courtroom erupted into hushed gasps, a ripple of murmurs spreading through the rows of spectators. Even Richard's lawyer stiffened, his grip tightening on his pen. Richard's expression darkened, his mouth parting slightly as if he might protest, but he quickly shut it, nostrils flaring. And beside Sophie, Max sat tall and unwavering, his golden fur gleaming under the fluorescent lights, his warm brown eyes fixed on her, filled with quiet understanding. It was as if he was telling her without words, "You did it. You're safe now." The judge didn't react to the murmurs around him. He merely straightened his papers, the finality in his movements slicing through the tension like a blade. "In light of this new testimony," he said, his voice even and decisive, "and given the clear signs of distress, I see no reason to grant custody to Mr. Reynolds." He turned toward Ruth, his expression softening slightly. "Full custody is awarded to Ms. Ruth Reynolds." For a moment, Ruth didn't move. Then, as the words settled in, a choked sound escaped her lips. Her hands flew to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. Relief, joy, and overwhelming love crashed into her all at once. She turned toward Sophie, who was already looking up at her, uncertain but hopeful. Sophie let out a breath she hadn't even realized she was holding. The weight that had sat on her small shoulders for so long lifted. She was free. And Max? He wagged his tail, leaning against Sophie, his presence solid and warm. If he could speak, he would have told her, "I told you I'd always protect you." Richard rose abruptly, his chair scraping against the polished floor. His face was red, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked painful. "This is absurd," he muttered under his breath, shoving past the table as he stormed toward the exit. His lawyer called after him, but it was no use. The murmurs of the courtroom followed him, a chorus of disbelief and quiet judgment. The powerful businessman, the man who had spent years twisting the truth to his advantage, had finally been exposed. They had won. Sophie had spent so many nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering what would happen, wondering if anyone would ever believe her, if she would always have to walk on eggshells, always have to measure her words, always have to pretend. She had tried to be brave, tried to convince herself that maybe this was just how things were, that maybe she was wrong for feeling the way she did. But Max had never let her believe that. He had been there through the worst of it, pressing his warm body against her when she needed comfort, standing in front of her when she needed protection. He had seen the truth before anyone else did. And when the moment came, when she needed someone to speak for her, he had done exactly that. Now, sitting in the courtroom with her mother's arms wrapped tightly around her, Sophie could barely process it. It was over. She didn't have to pretend anymore. She didn't have to be afraid. She glanced down at Max, his tail wagging softly as he looked up at her, his brown eyes filled with quiet understanding. She smiled, reaching down to run her fingers through his fur. She couldn't imagine what it would have been like without him. She didn't want to, because in a world where the truth was often buried beneath lies, where fear could silence even the strongest voices, Max had made sure hers was heard. That evening, as the golden hues of sunset poured through the windows, Sophie sat curled up on the couch, wrapped in a soft blanket. Max lay beside her, his head resting comfortably in her lap, his tail thumping lazily against the cushions. The weight of the day, the fear, the uncertainty, it had all melted away. Ruth sat beside them, watching her daughter with gentle eyes. She reached out, brushing a hand through Sophie's hair, tucking a stray curl behind her ear. "You were so brave today," she whispered, her voice full of pride, full of love. Sophie's fingers buried into Max's fur, feeling the warmth of her best friend beside her. She looked up at her mother and smiled, a small, tired but genuine smile. "I wasn't alone," she murmured, because through every moment of doubt, through every time she had been too scared to speak, Max had been there. He had known, he had understood, and when she needed him most, he had done what no one else could. He had shown the world what she couldn't say out loud. Ruth kissed the top of Sophie's head, holding her close. Outside, the sky darkened into deep blues and purples, the stars beginning to twinkle like tiny lights in the vast expanse. But inside, there was warmth. There was safety. There was love. Because sometimes the most loyal friends aren't the ones who speak. They're the ones who listen. But the truth, once revealed, could not be undone. Richard Reynolds had spent his life controlling the narrative, shaping how others saw him, ensuring his reputation remained untarnished. But in the end, he had been exposed not by another attorney, not by a mountain of legal documents, but by his own daughter. By the small, quiet girl who had once been too afraid to speak. By the dog who had seen past every lie. The ruling had been swift. Full custody was awarded to Ruth, and Richard had left the courtroom not as the powerful man he had always been, but as a father who had lost his daughter. The reporters who once flocked to him for his business ventures now whispered about the case, about the man who had nearly deceived the court. His business partners distanced themselves, his polished reputation tainted by the very truth he had tried to bury. For a time, he disappeared. Sophie no longer had to live under the weight of his expectations. She no longer had to listen to the sharp tone in his voice or watch as his anger simmered beneath his charming facade. She no longer had to pretend that she was happy when, deep down, she had been scared. She was free. Max had stayed by her side through it all. He had been there on the first night in their new home, curled up at the foot of her bed as she finally slept without fear. He had been there when Ruth knelt beside her and whispered, "You're safe now," brushing a hand through her hair as she hugged Max tightly. And he had been there when Sophie, despite everything, still found herself thinking about her father. Because no matter how much pain he had caused, he was still her dad. She thought about the moments before things had changed, before the fights, before the harsh words. She remembered the times he had lifted her onto his shoulders, the way he had once made her laugh. She had loved him once, and a part of her still did. Months passed. Then a year. And then, one day, a letter arrived. It wasn't long. It wasn't full of excuses. Just an apology. Richard had lost everything, but in losing everything, he had been forced to face the man he had become, and he didn't like what he saw. For the first time in his life, he couldn't fix things with money or power. He had to change. He had to earn back what he had lost. He asked if she would be willing to see him, not as the man who had once tried to control her life, but as the father who wanted to be better. Ruth had been hesitant, but she left the choice to Sophie. And Sophie, after a long moment, said yes. The day they met again, she was no longer the timid girl sitting in a courtroom afraid to speak. She was stronger now. She was free, and she had Max by her side as always, as she stood face to face with the man who had once made her afraid to tell the truth. Richard looked different. He no longer had the unshakable confidence he once wore like armor. He looked human. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said quietly. "I don't expect anything. I just want to try. If you'll let me." Sophie studied him for a long time. Max, sitting at her feet, didn't growl, didn't stand protectively in front of her like he once had. Instead, he simply watched, waiting. And after a long pause, Sophie nodded. She didn't know what the future held. She didn't know if her father could truly change. But for the first time in a long time, she had a choice. She wasn't afraid anymore. And Max? He wagged his tail, leaning against her, as if to say, no matter what happens next, you won't face it alone. This story is a powerful reminder that the truth always finds its way out, no matter how deeply it's buried, no matter how much someone tries to hide it. Because sometimes, the bravest voices aren't the loudest. They're the quiet ones, the ones too afraid to speak, but who still find a way to be heard. Never underestimate the bond between a child and their dog. In a world where people can lie, deceive, and manipulate, a dog sees only the truth. They protect, they love, and when the moment comes, they stand up for the ones who need them most. And never ignore the signs that someone might need help. Fear doesn't always come in shouts. It lingers in silences, in hesitant words, in the way someone holds themselves just a little too tightly. Sometimes, all it takes is one person or one loyal friend to notice. Because when the truth finally comes to light, it changes everything. Subscribe for more inspiring stories.